Alright, in this video we're going to turn our focus to the Pacific Theater in World War II, where the United States is going to be taking on the Japanese. Now, this is obviously a very different enemy than the Germans and the Italians, and it's also a different landscape. And so we're going to talk about how all of that is going to impact and make the Pacific Theater very different from the theater in Europe. We're also going to see some of the famous battles from this time period in the Pacific Theater. December 7th, 1941, obviously the event that draws us into the war, that is Pearl Harbor Day. And so when the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor, a day later the president will ask the Congress to declare war on the Japanese Empire. But we talked about it's not just Pearl Harbor that's being hit. It is the Philippines, places like that that are in the Pacific. We talked about the War Relocation Act, this Executive Order 9066. The president says, okay, if you've got heritage from one of these countries we're fighting against in World War II, you can be moved, if you're thought to be a risk, into internment camps. And so there's a lot of kind of not paying attention to the Constitution that's going on there. You are being held without, obviously, doing a crime or being accused or convicted of a crime. His excuse was it's wartime. And so it was a wartime power the president was able to get this done with. We talked about in visuals and in our looking at exactly what was happening there on December 8th on the other side of the international date line, the idea that there were a group of these men, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, that come out of those internment camps to serve extremely honorably in World War II. When the Japanese run us out of the Philippines, though, they capture a great number of American and Filipino soldiers. In the lower part of the Philippines, there was a place called Bataan, and they will put 76,000 Allied POWs on a forced march of over 60 miles. Just during that march, 5,000 Americans plus a lot of our allies will die either from conditions or Japanese cruelty as they're forced to march. You can see this propaganda poster that I put up there for you that is making reference to the Bataan Death March and that particular day. Got a battle here to show you this battle map, and don't try and make hides or hair out of it. This is the Battle of Coral Sea, and the reason I put the Battle of Coral Sea up here is it is our first indication that something really different is going to happen in the Pacific. The Battle of Coral Sea is the first Navy battle ever fought where ships didn't see each other. So if you remember, we were doing that early war unit, right? The idea was that ships had to be very close to each other to fire on each other. Well, now with the invention and the proliferation of aircraft carriers, the ships don't have to be close. We would send our planes up, they would send their planes up, the planes would fight, the planes would attack the other side's ships, but those ships, at least in the Battle of Coral Sea, aren't getting close enough to see each other. So naval warfare has changed a great deal with those aircraft carriers being brought in. And the Battle of Coral Sea is kind of our first indication of just how much that's changed. The turning point of the war in the Pacific, is the Battle of Midway. I've got the dates up there for you. It's June 4th to the 7th of 1942. Now, if you remember, when we talked about Pearl Harbor, we said on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese are trying to knock the Americans out for a year. Well, this is just 6 months after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and we've got the turning point of the war. Now, Midway was a small island midway between Hawaii and Japan, and so strategically it's very important. and there's this huge battle that'll take place. I've got two Midway movies, one more recent, one from the 1970s, both very good in the film library. If you're interested in how this particular battle breaks down, it's important because the Americans are able to sink a couple of Japanese aircraft carriers, and they're able to kind of grab a hold of this island of Midway. What we started to do, the tactic they was use was what was called island hopping. So we take over an island, clear off the Japanese, build runways and barracks and things that we needed, and then use that island to attack the next one. And then we do the same thing to the next island, and you go. And if you had trouble taking an island, well, you could skip it, right, if you could get close enough to the next one. But the idea is you want to hop and get closer and closer to Japan. The idea is to get those bombers close enough that you're going to be able to attack the mainland and take the fight to the Japanese. And so the Battle of Midway is going to allow us to get a firmer foothold much closer to Japan than where we would have been. But some amazing stories that come out of there. I'm going to put some videos up on the playlist for you to take a look at to dig a little bit more into the Battle of Midway. So here, got a map here for you again, as you can kind of see where the island itself is situated. Those islands that you see coming off there at the northern part of the map are that arm that comes off of Alaska. And so very close to what would be United States territory there as well. April 18th, 1943 is the death of Admiral Yamamoto. You'll remember this guy is the guy that plans the attack on Pearl Harbor. Didn't like it a whole lot though. Remember, he said, "I fear all we've done is awaken a sleeping giant." He was a key leader for the Japanese though. We break a Japanese code, figure out he's going to be on a flight from point A to point B, and we end up making the effort and shooting down his plane to kind of rob the Japanese of his expertise for the war. One of the more famous soldiers in this theater in World War II is John F. Kennedy. He's not the only one. George H.W. Bush, his dad, or George H.W. Bush, the father of George W. Bush, is the youngest fighter pilot in the Pacific in World War II, and he'll fight there as well. But John F. Kennedy is a PT boat captain. It's a small boat. His boat gets rammed by the Japanese, sends him flying, and he ends up swimming one of his sailors to shore, saving this guy's life. It gives him a back injury that he will struggle with really for the rest of his life, the back pain that comes from that injury. But it makes him famous. He already had a dad who was an ambassador, so people knew the Kennedy name. But it's these heroic acts are going to let more people know the name John F. Kennedy. And of course, he will, after the war in 1960, be elected president of the United States. October 25th, 1944, we see the first kamikaze being used. Kamikaze is a Japanese term that means divine wind. And it was from a story in their history of this fleet that was trying to invade, and a hurricane blew up and destroyed all the ships before they could invade Japan. And the Japanese called that wind the kamikaze. Well, the war is starting to go very much against them, and so they decide they're going to send pilots up with the idea that they're going to load their plane with fuel and bullets, not to fire, but to crash into ships that the United States has. One of our admirals there, you can see, is the only weapon they feared of the war. It wasn't extremely effective. It was more of a psychological tactic. This didn't happen a whole lot, but just the willingness they had to do that. I've got a couple of pictures up on canvas. If you've ever had Mr. Bartold as a sub, his dad was on a ship that was hit by a kamikaze, and he gave me, let me scan a before and after picture of the ship that are up on canvas. The home islands of Japan are where we're trying to get, right, to attack. Honshu's where Tokyo is. Probably most of the places, if you've seen Cobra Kai or Karate Kid Part 2, Okinawa, that's where Mr. Miyagi, the character from that uh, story universe, is from. It's the bottom island in Japan, but we're trying to get here. So one of the things that we needed to be able to attack there were landing bases in case our planes got in trouble. And so that makes the island of Iwo Jima really important. We talked about Iwo Jima already in the visuals video that we did, but I want to show you this picture again. Like I said, probably one of the most famous pictures in American history. It's one that will be used to sell a lot of war bonds back home, but you can see just there's not a whole lot to the island of Iwo Jima. The only really distinguishing landmark is Mount Suribachi there, that mountain that you see. But it's volcanic rock, so there's not trees and things like that that are there. But what the Japanese done had been to dig an elaborate system of tunnels underneath underneath this island, and so there are like 30,000 of them that are defending the island of Iwo Jima, and most of them will either die or commit suicide rather than be captured by the Americans. But this flag being planted at the top of Mount Suribachi was obviously a big deal. We said for kind of the psyche of people back home, giving them something to rally around. We wanted Iwo Jima in case something happened with one of the atomic bomb missions. That we were going to be able to have a place for those planes to land. Obviously, if you pay it that much for a weapon, you don't want engine trouble or something like that, meaning that it just goes into the ocean. You don't get anything out of it. The Battle of Okinawa, one of my favorite war movies, probably of all time, but definitely the last 10 years, is one called Hacksaw Ridge. It tells the story of a guy named Desmond Doss, who was a conscientious objector. He didn't want to carry a gun into combat, but he wanted to be a combat medic. And he participates in the Battle of Okinawa. I've got a copy of it in the film library. The movie's just incredible. The faith that this guy has. But this is an attack on Japanese soil. Japanese civilians, just to kind of give you an idea of how why Harry Truman makes the decision to drop the atomic bomb. Instead of being captured, there are like 4,000 Japanese civilians that will commit mass suicide by throwing themselves off a cliff at the Battle of Okinawa. And it just kind of shows us that it's going to take something extraordinary to get these people to surrender and to not have to obviously go and wipe out all of the Japanese people, but getting very close. We don't use the atomic bombs um, on Tokyo, we said, because that's where the emperor lived. We do firebomb Tokyo. If you add up the square tonnage of the bombs, we drop more bombs on Tokyo. Because of the way that the buildings were constructed, firebombs were really effective at just kind of devastating that city. Um, April 12th, 1945, Franklin Roosevelt dies of a cerebral hemorrhage. So before the war's over, even in Europe, but definitely in the Pacific, Franklin Roosevelt dies. Harry Truman will take his place. And we've mentioned before, he's got to make a decision between do we invade with Operation Olympic, or do we end up using the atomic weapons. September 2nd, the Japanese formally surrender, and it is VJ Day. And so that is the day that the war in the Pacific is officially over. One other kind of cool story that's got a local connection, because the ship is named after our state capital. The USS Indianapolis is a battleship that's going to deliver the Little Boy bomb to a little island called Timian, where they were going to put it together and put it on the Enola Gay, obviously to go be dropped on Hiroshima. When the Indianapolis drops it off, nobody knew what they were doing. The captain knew. He actually had the material welded to the floor of his cabin so that nothing could happen to it. But everybody called it the gadget that they were delivering this bomb to this island. So nobody really knew what was going on, but they wanted to keep it really secret. And so the people of the Indianapolis were told, hey, you can't have radio contact, that sort of thing, that's going to be there. So their radio silences are heading back. They're torpedoed by a Japanese ship, and it sinks really quickly. And so like 1,100 sailors go into the water, thinking that somebody's going to come rescue us, but no rescue call's gone out. And so they're in the water for days. And very quickly sharks will start to attack this group of men. And so there's only maybe 300, 400 survivors of these shark attacks that happened in the aftermath of the sinking of the Indianapolis. If you go up to Monument Circle today, this is the monument that's there to the crew of the USS Indianapolis. That's there. There's also a famous scene from Jaws. I'll put up this one where the old sea captain that's taking him out hunting the shark in that movie is talking about serving on the USS Indianapolis. So that's just a little overview of the war in the Pacific. We've got some other videos and resources that are going to get you a little more involved in really kind of zooming in on some particular parts, but just wanted to give you an idea how the whole thing was going to go.